Hello everyone. Welcome back to Mr. Nightvale. Today we're covering 10 of the most disturbing true cruise scam stories ever submitted to this channel. Please subscribe, turn the bell on, because this channel is about slow-burning authentic horror over cheap jump scares. And if something like this has ever happened to you, share your story in the comments. Your experience could be the next one we bring to light. Let's get into it. I saved for 14 months to take this cruise by myself. Not because anyone died, not because of some dramatic breakup, just because I turned 26 and realized I'd never gone anywhere without someone else planning it for me. So when the ship docked in Cozumel on day 2, I was standing at the rail before 6 in the morning, watching the water turn from navy to that impossible turquoise, feeling like I'd finally done something right. The plan was simple: get off the ship, do a snorkeling excursion, get back in time for the 4 o'clock all aboard. I'd looked at the ship's own excursion desk the night before, but the line to book anything in person stretched halfway down the atrium, and the online prices felt padded, tourist tax padded, the kind of markup you pay for the peace of mind of a name brand. So when I stepped off the gangway and a man in a collared shirt with a laminated badge and a clipboard fell into step beside me and said, "Snorkeling trip, miss. Best reef, half the price of what they charge you up there," I slowed down. What got me wasn't the sales pitch. It was that, before I told him anything, he glanced at the massive white hull behind me and said, "You're on the one that leaves at 4, right? Plenty of time. We'll have you back by 2:30. I hadn't said a word about departure time. It felt less like a stranger guessing and more like someone who was plugged into the same system as the crew. Someone who knew the schedule because he was supposed to know it. That's the part that let my guard down. Not confidence, familiarity. I paid him $40 cash, no receipt, just a torn ticket stub with a phone number written on it in pen. And he pointed me toward a van parked in a lot, 2 blocks from the pier, away from the official taxi line, away from anyone wearing a lanyard that matched the ship's colors. The van had no logo on it, just white paint, a cracked windshield, and a driver who didn't introduce himself. But when I climbed in, there was a couple already sitting in the back, mid-30s maybe, sunburned in the way, that told me they'd been on this cruise longer than I had. The woman smiled at me like we were old friends and said, "First time doing this excursion? We did it last year out of Nassau. Same kind of setup. It's always a little janky at first, but it's a blast once you're in the water." Her husband laughed and said something about how the official tours were a rip-off anyway. I sat down. My shoulders came down from around my ears for the first time since I'd handed over the cash. If they were doing this too, if they'd done it before and lived to tell the story, then I was fine. That's what I told myself. I'd transferred my trust from a stranger with a clipboard to a stranger with a wedding ring, and somehow that felt like due diligence. We hadn't been driving 15 minutes when the van pulled off the main road into a gravel lot in front of a building with hand-painted signs, advertising silver jewelry and leather goods. The driver killed the engine and turned around. "Quick stop," he said. 15 minutes, then straight to the beach. Nobody had mentioned a shop. My itinerary, the one scrawled on that torn ticket, said snorkeling and transportation. Nothing about retail. But the couple was already climbing out. So I followed, telling myself 15 minutes wasn't going to sink my whole day. 15 minutes turned into 40. A woman inside kept refilling little plastic cups of something sweet and pressing bracelets into my hands. And every time I tried to walk toward the door, someone materialized to ask if I'd found the one. When I finally told the driver I needed to go, that I had a boat to catch, he shrugged and said the van wasn't leaving until the owner said it was leaving. That this was part of how the tour worked, that everybody stopped here. I remember standing in that doorway doing math in my head, 4 o'clock minus travel time, minus this shop, minus however long the water part would take. And for the first time that morning, I felt something tighten in my stomach that wasn't excitement. We finally got back on the road, and the beach, when we reached it, wasn't the postcard reef I'd been promised. It was a strip of sand with a few plastic kayaks and a bin of snorkel masks that looked like they'd been sitting in salt water since some earlier decade. No lifeguard tower. No briefing about currents. Just a guide who pointed at the water and said, "Reef's out past those rocks. Go have fun." I strapped on a mask with a strap so brittle it had already been knotted twice. And about 10 minutes into the swim, salt water started leaking in around the seal. I panicked more than the situation probably called for, treading water, coughing, trying to clear a mask that wouldn't clear, until the husband from the van paddled over and helped me flip it and reseat it against my face. My heart was going so hard I could feel it in my ears. It was the kind of moment that should have been a clean signal, a full stop, cheap gear, plus no supervision, plus middle of the ocean equals leave now. But by the time I was breathing normally again, I'd already decided to explain it away as my own fault for not checking the strap. Back on the sand, drying off, I reached into my dry bag for my phone to check the time and noticed the way the zipper sat, slightly open, not the way I leave it. My wallet was still there. My phone was still there. But the folded bills I'd tucked into the side pocket, the backup cash I kept separate from my wallet for exactly a moment like this, felt thinner than I remembered. I counted it twice, standing there dripping, and told myself I must have miscounted back on the ship. It didn't occur to me, not yet, that anyone could have gone through that bag while I was flailing around in the water with a broken mask, and 2 strangers were the only people close enough to have done it. The guide told us the van would be back by 1:30. 1:30 came and went. He said 15 more minutes. Then he said the driver had another group and would be there by 2. I watched the sun move and did the math again, and this time the number scared me enough that I said something out loud, to anyone who'd listen, that I could not miss this ship. That's when another cluster of stranded tourists, people who hadn't been on my van at all, wandered over from a different patch of sand, and one of them, a guy in his 50s from a totally different excursion group, laughed in a way that had no humor in it, and said this exact operator had stranded his brother-in-law's group the week before. That it was apparently a known thing among people who'd cruised this port more than once, that the guy with the clipboard rotated locations near the pier every few days, so complaints wouldn't stick to one face. Hearing that didn't make me feel better. It made the whole day rearrange itself in my head, from bad luck into something closer to a pattern other people had already fallen into. At that point, I stopped waiting. A small group of us, 5 or 6 strangers who'd never have spoken to each other under normal circumstances, pooled cash and flagged down an actual licensed taxi idling near the shop, a real one, meter and registration sticker and everything, driven by a man who took one look at our faces and said, "All aboard's at 4, yeah?" without us telling him. He drove like the last 30 minutes of the day depended on it, because they did. And for the first time since I'd stepped off that gangway, I felt like I was in the hands of someone who actually knew the schedule because his job required him to, not because he'd guessed it to sound trustworthy. We got to the terminal at 3:52. I could see the crew already starting to draw up the gangway ramp, that hydraulic whine that means the ship is done waiting. I ran, flip-flops in one hand, dry bag banging against my hip, and a deckhand saw me coming and shouted for them to hold it, reaching down to help pull me up the last few feet of ramp while it was still lifting. I stood on deck bent over my knees, soaked in sweat and salt, shaking, and it took a solid minute before I could say anything to anyone. When I finally caught my breath, I asked the crew member standing there, half joking, half not, whether the excursion company I'd used was one the ship worked with. He gave me a look I still think about, not annoyance, not surprise, just a flat, practiced blankness, the look of someone who has answered that exact question many times before. He told me, gently, that the ship only vouches for excursions booked through the shore desk, and that there had actually been a notice in that morning's daily newsletter, the one slipped under cabin doors overnight, warning passengers about unaffiliated vendors working the pier with clipboards near the gangway. I remembered seeing that newsletter. I remembered folding it in half to use as a coaster for my coffee, without reading past the cruise director's joke of the day. That night, back in my cabin, unpacking my dry bag to let it air out, I found the real damage. Not the loose cash from the beach, which I'd already written off, but a zippered inner pocket I hadn't opened once all day, the one where I kept a folded emergency $200 for exactly this kind of trip. It was empty, And sitting there on my bed working out how that pocket could have been opened, I thought about the couple, how they'd boarded my van already inside it, how they'd vanished from the beach sometime after the mask incident, and I'd assumed they'd gone back on an earlier van, how I never actually saw them again for the rest of the cruise, despite the ship not being nearly big enough for that to be a coincidence, over 4 more days at sea. The next morning, I went to guest services, not to report the missing money exactly, but because I wanted to ask if they could pass a thank you along to the couple from the excursion, the ones who'd helped me with my mask. I described them as best I could, gave the first names they'd told me. The woman at the desk typed for a moment, checked twice, and told me there was no one matching that description or those names anywhere on the passenger manifest. Not a mismatch, not on a different deck, not on the ship at all. I stood there for a second, feeling something click into place that I hadn't let myself see while it was happening. They were never fellow passengers. They were part of the same operation as the man with the clipboard, planted in that van specifically to make a stranger relax, to turn a shady setup into something that felt shared and familiar, to have a warm hand ready in the water at exactly the moment I was distracted enough not to notice a bag being unzipped on the beach behind me. The detour to the shop, the broken gear, the vanishing van, none of it was incompetence. It was choreography, and I'd walked through every step of it congratulating myself on finding a local deal. I filed a report with the ship, who said they'd flagged the vendor with the port authority, though I have no illusions about how far that actually goes. What I know for certain is that I've cruised twice since then, and both times I walked straight past every clipboard and every folding table set up within 100 feet of that gangway, no matter how good the price sounded or how naturally the person holding it seemed to already know my ship, my schedule, or my name. If it isn't booked through the ship's own desk, or through an operator the ship will actually put its name behind, it doesn't matter how friendly the van feels once you're inside it. Some of the nicest people you meet on a trip like that were never on your side to begin with. We boarded in Seattle on a gray Saturday morning, the 4 of us dragging suitcases up the gangway like pack mules, and there was a guy in a fleece vest with a camera the size of a toaster oven who stepped in front of us and said, "Big smiles, welcome aboard," before we'd even shown our boarding passes. My daughter Mia, who was 7 and had been vibrating with excitement since the airport, threw up a peace sign. My son Jonah just stood there looking dazed. The photographer clicked twice, said something about the photo being ready later that day, and stuck a little sticker with a barcode on my husband Danny's shirt. We didn't think twice about it. It felt like the kind of thing that happens at theme parks. A freebie, a little welcome aboard flourish. Nobody in that line was reading the fine print on a sticker. By day 2, I started noticing the pattern, and once you notice it, you can't stop. There was a photographer at the formal dining room entrance, another one stationed by the ice sculpture, a third one who appeared, almost like clockwork, right as we walked out onto the observation deck for the first glacier sighting. At first, I thought it was just enthusiastic staffing. Cruise ships love their theatrics. But then I watched one of them touch her earpiece and glance at a clipboard, before repositioning herself exactly where our family was about to walk, like she'd been told which deck we'd be on and when. That's not luck. That's logistics. Somebody somewhere had a schedule with our name on it. The keycard thing is what actually got under my skin. I watched the photographer scan Danny's cabin card before snapping a shot of the kids by the railing, and I asked her, half joking, "What's that for? Are you selling my identity too?" She laughed the laugh of someone who's heard that joke 400 times and said it just links the photo to our folio number so we can find it later in the gallery. Which sounds convenient until you realize it means every single photo taken of your children on that ship is already sitting in a database tied to your credit card before you've agreed to buy a single print. I got curious enough to ask a crew member at the photo kiosk, casually, what the packages usually run. She rattled off a number, then added, almost as an aside, that the family bundle price goes up 2 days from now, once we hit the halfway point of the cruise. I hadn't asked about timing. She volunteered it. That's when it clicked, that this wasn't a static price list. It was a countdown, engineered to make procrastination expensive. The exact same trick furniture stores use with their Sale ends Sunday banners that have said the same thing every Sunday for 6 years. That night at the bar, I got to talking with an older couple, Frank and Diane, on their third Alaska cruise. And I mentioned the photo thing half-jokingly, expecting them to laugh it off with me. Instead, Diane just sighed and said, last year they'd walked off that ship $800 lighter because their grandkids were in half the shots, and there's no way in hell she was going to be the grandmother who didn't buy the picture of her grandbaby's first glacier. Frank added, quieter, that the sales guy that year followed them to guest services and stood there while they debated it. It wasn't just us. It was a machine that had been fine-tuned on thousands of families before we ever set foot on the gangway, and grandparents were apparently the softest target of all. 2 days later, we hit Glacier Bay, and this was supposed to be the moment, the actual reason we booked this trip. Blue ice cracking off a wall of compressed centuries, a low groaning boom every time a chunk calved into the water, and right at the best vantage point on the observation deck, there was a spot roped off with a little brass placard that said, Photo Opportunity. A fake wooden railing bolted in front of the real railing, so the background would look cleaner in the shot. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. They'd built a set, in front of an actual glacier, a natural wonder that predates the concept of currency. Someone had installed a prop railing, so the marketing photo would look better than the view you were already standing in front of for free. That's when I did the math for real, standing there with my coffee going cold. $600 and change for the package. We'd skipped the helicopter glacier landing excursion for the whole family because it ran close to $700, and Danny and I had agreed that was too steep for a few hours on the ice. So the photo package, the thing we hadn't even asked for, cost almost exactly what we'd turned down as too extravagant 3 weeks earlier while budgeting this trip at our kitchen table. Later that same day, I was flipping through the digital preview gallery on the screen outside the photo shop, just scrolling, not buying, and I stopped on a shot of Mia laughing at dinner. It was a good photo, genuinely, the kind you'd frame. And then I remembered the photographer that night, crouching down, saying, "Okay, sweetheart, now laugh like Daddy just told the funniest joke ever." And Mia, obliging, produced this bright, camera-ready laugh on command. The same laugh in 3 other photos from 3 other nights. My kid had learned to perform joy for a stranger's lens, and I hadn't even clocked it happening in real time. That one sat with me longer than I expected it to. On the last night, we made the mistake of walking past the gallery around 8, and it was a full-blown showroom by then. Screens everywhere. A staff member with a headset practically materializing at my elbow saying today was the final day to lock in pricing before disembarkation tomorrow, after which the photos would simply cease to exist. Deleted. Gone. No exceptions. I said we'd think about it. She said there wasn't really time to think about it. 10 feet away, I heard another staff member say, word for word, the exact same line to a different family, down to the inflection on cease to exist. That's not 2 people who happen to think alike. That's a script. And once you hear the seams of a script, you can't unhear them. We left without buying anything that first pass. And on our way back to the cabin, I saw one of the photographers, off the clock, out of uniform, sitting alone by the vending machines, with the particular slump of someone who's been standing for 11 hours. I recognized her from the glacier deck. I don't know why I stopped, but I did. And I asked if the push to sell tonight was always this intense. She looked around before she answered, which told me something on its own, and said quietly that photographers get reviewed on conversion numbers, that a bad week can mean fewer contract renewals, and that corporate tracks which staff member is standing where when a purchase happens. She wasn't complaining, exactly. She just sounded tired in the specific way of someone whose paycheck depends on convincing strangers to buy things the strangers didn't ask for. That conversation took some of the anger out of me and put it somewhere else, at whoever built the incentive structure, rather than the 23-year-old standing on her feet all day, pointing a camera at other people's kids. So when we went back to the gallery the second time, I wasn't looking for a fight. I was just done being polite about it. I told the guy at the counter, flatly, that we weren't purchasing the package, that I understood the deadline was tonight, and that was fine. We'd live without the prints. He did the thing where he pretended to check with a manager, came back 2 minutes later, and suddenly the $600 package was $310, today only, just for us, because we'd been such a lovely family to work with all week. Which was its own answer, really. If a price can drop by half the second a customer says no, the original number was never a price. It was an opening bid. We still said no. Danny actually laughed out loud, the kind of laugh that surprises you on your way out of your own mouth. And we walked out of that gallery empty-handed, and frankly, a little proud of ourselves, like we'd dodged something. I want to tell you that was the end of it. A clean little victory to close the story on. It wasn't. About 6 weeks after we got home, I was going through the credit card statement doing the post-vacation reckoning everybody dreads, and there was a charge I didn't recognize, $11 and change, from something called a Memories Club membership. I called the number on the statement, sat on hold long enough to reheat my coffee twice, and finally got someone who explained that browsing the digital gallery kiosk, the one where I'd scrolled past Mia's dinner photo, apparently counted as opting in to a recurring membership, under terms I never saw, because I never scrolled to the bottom of a screen I hadn't realized was a contract. It renews every month unless you cancel it directly, and it had already charged us once before I caught it. So we'd walked off that ship thinking we'd beaten the game, $600 richer for having said no to a salesman's face. And the whole time there was a second, quieter hand, already in our pocket, one that didn't need a photographer, or a countdown timer, or a script, just a kiosk screen, and a family too busy looking at pictures of their own kids to read what they were agreeing to underneath them. I've been cruising since before some of the crew members on this ship were born. 40 years, 20 cruises, and my wife Diane will tell you I've never once gotten seasick, never once missed a departure, never once needed the little laminated map they hand out at the gangway. I know how a ship works. I know which buffet lines to avoid at noon, and which bartenders remember your drink after one night. So when we sailed into the Mediterranean this spring for our 20th trip together, I walked up to the currency exchange desk on deck 5, like I owned the place, slid $400 across the counter, and told the young woman behind it, I'd take euros, please. No rush, no fuss. I didn't look at the board above her head. Why would I? I'd been doing this exact thing since Diane and I were in our 40s. I folded the euros into my money clip, told Diane it was one less thing to think about once we hit port, and went off to get a coffee feeling pretty good about myself. That good feeling lasted about 4 days. We were at dinner with another couple we'd met at the pool, a retired school teacher named Frank and his wife, and Frank mentioned, almost as a joke, that he'd gotten murdered on the exchange rate that morning in the ship's shop. I laughed along with him, said something like, "That's why I don't even check it. I just trust them." And Frank gave me this look. Not a mean look, just a look like he felt a little sorry for me. I didn't think much of it right then. I went back to my shrimp cocktail, but something about the way he said it sat in my stomach the rest of the night, the same way you feel a splinter you can't quite see. The next morning, I dug the receipt out of my wallet, more out of boredom than suspicion, and I walked back past that same currency desk to compare what I'd been given against what was posted on the board. And there it was, right there in plain digital numbers, a spread I hadn't bothered to notice because I'd never once looked for it. I did the math twice because I didn't trust the first answer. It wasn't a few dollars. It wasn't rounding. It was real money, gone, for doing absolutely nothing except handing cash across a counter. I told Diane that night, half embarrassed, half wanting her to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, she went quiet for a second and said, "Oh, honey, I did that too. Wednesday, when you were at the gym, I needed euros for the shops in Naples, and the desk was right there." My stomach dropped a second time. It wasn't just my mistake anymore. We'd both walked into the same door, on the same ship, days apart, and neither of us had thought to mention it to the other, because neither of us thought there was anything to mention. So the next afternoon I went down to guest services, not really to complain, more just to understand how bad it was. The man behind the counter was polite, pulled up something on his screen, and told me the rate I'd received matched exactly what had been posted that day. He wasn't defensive about it. He said it plainly, like it was the most normal thing in the world, because to him it was. That was the part that stung more than the money. Nobody had hidden anything from me. It had been sitting right there in lit-up numbers above the counter the entire time, and I'd walked past it without a glance, the same way you walk past a speed limit sign on a road you've driven 1,000 times. That evening at the pool bar, I brought it up with a few other long-time cruisers, people who'd been doing this even longer than I had, and I watched face after face do the same thing Franks had done at dinner. One woman said she'd stopped using the onboard desk years ago, after her son did the math for her on a cruise to Alaska. Another man said he still used it every time because, in his words, what else are you gonna do? Walk to a bank in the middle of the ocean? Nobody was shocked by what I was telling them. That was the strange part. It wasn't news to any of them. It was just something everybody quietly knew and nobody talked about, like a family secret you only bring up after a couple of drinks. 2 days later, we had a satellite signal strong enough to call our son back home, who works in finance, and I told him the story mostly as a funny bit of vacation gossip. He didn't laugh. He asked me for the exact numbers, did some quick math out loud while I sat there holding the phone, and told me the spread I'd eaten was close to 20%. Not the interest rate, not a fee, the actual difference between what my dollars were worth and what I walked away with in euros. 20%. I've negotiated car loans with better numbers than that. That's when it really started to eat at me. Not the $400, but the arithmetic of it stretched backward across 4 decades. 20 cruises. How many times had I strolled up to that same kind of desk on 20 different ships, feeling exactly the same false confidence, never once checking a posted rate because I'd built my whole identity around not needing to. I lay awake that night doing rough math in my head, cruise by cruise, guessing at amounts I couldn't fully remember, and even being conservative, even assuming I'd gotten lucky some years or hadn't exchanged cash every single trip. The number I landed on made my chest tight. It wasn't hundreds, it was thousands, spread out quietly over a lifetime, never once showing up as a single painful moment, just bleeding out a little at a time, in a way that never once tripped an alarm. What really got to me wasn't even the total. It was who I'd been on every one of those cruises. I was the guy at the dinner table giving the new couples advice. I was the one who told first-timers which shore excursions were worth it and which ones to skip. The one people asked which deck had the quietest cabins. I'd built a whole little reputation, in my own head if nowhere else, as someone who knew how this all worked. And here I was finding out that on one of the most basic things, the actual money changing hands, I'd been sleepwalking the entire time, letting familiarity stand in for actual attention. I couldn't just sit on it. 2 nights later, at a table with 6 other couples, I told the whole story out loud. The $400, the 20%, all of it, waiting to feel foolish, saying it in front of strangers. Instead, the table lit up. Everybody had something. One man said his father had been exchanging money on board for 30 years, and had no idea there was even a posted rate to check. A woman said her daughter had warned her before this exact trip, and she'd ignored it, because she didn't want to be rude to the desk staff. By the end of dinner, 3 different people had pulled out their phones to write themselves a note. I hadn't set out to warn anybody. I just wanted to stop feeling stupid alone. On the last full day of the cruise, standing in line to disembark, I caught myself, out of pure habit, drifting toward that same currency desk one more time to change back a bit of leftover cash before the airport. My hand was already reaching for my wallet before I even registered what I was doing. I stopped, looked up at the board, checked the number, and decided the airport ATM back home would do just fine. Diane was standing next to me, with her card already out, tapping it against her palm like she'd done this 100 times, and something about the ease of it made me ask her, right there in line, when she'd started doing that instead of exchanging cash. She looked at me kind of sideways and said she'd switched to using her debit card at ATMs on shore 3 or 4 cruises ago, after a friend back home mentioned the fees on board were brutal. I asked her why she never told me. She just shrugged and said she figured I already knew what I was doing, since I was the one who always seemed so sure of himself. 40 years of cruising, 20 trips together, and my own wife had quietly fixed this for herself years before I even noticed there was anything to fix, and never once said a word, because she didn't want to embarrass the guy who was supposed to be the expert. I've told that story to a dozen people since we got home, and every single time I get to the part about Diane and her debit card, I have to stop and laugh at myself, because that's really the whole thing right there. It was never about the ship trying to trick me. The rate was posted the whole time, plain as day, for anyone who bothered to look. I just never looked, because I'd convinced myself that 40 years of doing something a certain way meant I didn't need to check it anymore. Next cruise, and there will be a next one, I'm using my card at the local machines and glancing at that board every single time I walk past it, posted rate and all, whether I need cash that day or not. Old habits are what got me. I'd just rather they not get me again. I bought the top-tier internet package before I even unpacked my suitcase. $42 a day, the most expensive option on the list. The one with the little icon of a rocket ship next to the word unlimited. I wasn't there to relax. I was there to work from a boat, which sounds like a contradiction until you realize half my clients don't care where I am, as long as I show up on the call looking vaguely tan and competent. The whole trip was built around that promise. 7 days, 1 laptop, and a package specifically marketed as fast enough for video calls, uploads, everything. I remember reading the words, no data caps, no speed restrictions, on the purchase screen, and thinking, good, that's exactly the sentence I needed to hear. The first call, on day 1, somewhere past Florida, froze on my client's face mid-sentence, his mouth open on a word I never got to hear. I apologized, blamed it on being at sea, said something about satellites like I was some kind of expert, and he laughed it off. I didn't think much of it. Ships wobble, signals drop. That's just physics, I told myself, still sunburned and optimistic. Out of boredom more than suspicion, I ran a speed test that afternoon. The number that came back was something like 0.8 megabits down. Not gigabits, not even regular megabits in any respectable quantity. 0.8. I'd get faster service standing in a parking garage. I told myself it was a fluke. Maybe we were between satellite beams or repositioning, and ran it again an hour later. Same number, give or take a rounding error. At breakfast the next morning, I mentioned it to a woman at my table who turned out to be doing telehealth intake notes for a clinic back home, working the same kind of trip I was. She didn't even look up from her eggs. She said, "Oh yeah, that's just how it goes. By day 3, you'll be lucky to load an email." She said it the way you'd mention seasickness. A known inconvenience, not a malfunction. That was the moment the problem stopped being mine alone and started being something bigger, something with a pattern to it. So I did what anyone raised on customer service chat windows does. I opened the app and typed my complaint into a box. The response came back polished and useless. A script telling me to forget the network and reconnect, restart my device, clear my browser cache. The kind of advice you give someone before you've actually listened to the problem. I did all of it. I restarted my laptop twice. I turned my phone off and on, like that was going to fix a satellite dish somewhere above the Atlantic. Nothing changed. I pushed harder the next day, asked for someone above the first rep, and got a human who, whether by mistake or boredom, actually told me something true. She said the package includes a fair use allowance, and once you pass a certain amount of data, your connection gets deprioritized during busy periods. Deprioritized. That's the word they used instead of throttled, like it was a scheduling issue, and not the entire reason my video calls looked like a slideshow. That one sentence was the first real information I'd gotten in 3 days, and it wasn't information they'd handed me. I'd had to dig it out of her. Once I had the word allowance, I went looking for where exactly I was supposed to have known about it. I went back through the purchase screen I'd used at check-in, screenshotted everything, and found nothing about thresholds or fair use anywhere near the price or the word unlimited. It existed, eventually, 3 menus deep in a network management policy document, linked off a help page I never had a reason to visit, written in the kind of language that assumes you're a lawyer and a masochist. It wasn't hidden exactly. It just wasn't anywhere a normal, paying customer would ever be standing when they clicked buy. I went to guest services in person after that, hoping a face-to-face conversation would get me either a refund or an upgrade. I was told packages are non-refundable once activated. Company policy. Nothing personal. But the woman behind the desk, not unkindly, said I was maybe the fifth person that day asking the exact same question. Not the fifth person with an internet problem. The fifth person asking specifically whether they could get their money back because of it. That number stuck with me more than the throttling itself. This wasn't a bad signal day. This was a Tuesday. The timing got worse before it got better. I had an actual deadline, a video file a client needed by end of day. Nothing enormous, maybe 600 megabytes, the kind of file that uploads in the time it takes to make coffee on any normal connection. On the ship's connection, it sat at 2% for 40 minutes before failing outright. I tried tethering off my phone, forgetting for a second that we were 100 miles from the nearest cell tower and surrounded entirely by ocean, which is its own kind of stupid mistake you only make once. So I waited for the port day, which turned out to be Cozumel, and instead of the excursion I'd already paid for and was now missing, I speed-walked into town, looking for anything with the word cafe and the word Wi-Fi in the same sign. I found a place with 4 plastic tables and a router duct taped to the wall, paid cash for 45 minutes, and watched the upload bar crawl forward while sweating through my shirt in 90-degree heat, genuinely relieved when it finally said done. I thought that was the end of it. Ship's internet was garbage. I'd found a workaround. Lesson learned. Back to the deck chairs. Then, a week after the trip, going through my card statement to reconcile the whole ridiculous vacation, I found a second charge from the cruise line I hadn't authorized, labeled as a data overage fee. I read that twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. They had throttled my connection down to something barely functional, and then billed me extra for supposedly using too much data on a package that was advertised, in writing, as unlimited, capped and charged for going over the cap, on the same plan, in the same week. That's what sent me down the rabbit hole afterward, reading reviews and forum threads from other people, describing almost the exact same sequence. Different ships, different companies, same 3 moves. Sell it as unlimited. Quietly throttle it after some threshold nobody discloses at the point of sale. Then still find a way to bill an overage on top, because apparently unlimited has an asterisk the size of a life raft if you know where to look for the fine print. Guest services never budged, but my credit card company did, reversing the overage charge within 2 weeks once I explained the whole thing in writing, with screenshots attached. So that's the trip. I got a tan. I got a working vacation that mostly involved standing in a foreign parking lot paying strangers for Wi-Fi, and I got an education I didn't ask for. If you're ever buying the top package specifically to keep working, don't ask if it's unlimited. Everybody says yes to that question. Ask if it's throttled after a certain amount of data, ask them to define fair use in actual numbers, and get it in writing before you hand over your card. Unlimited and unthrottled are not the same word, no matter how badly the price tag wants you to believe they are. We saved for 14 months for that cruise, not because we couldn't have gone sooner, but because we wanted to do it right. Balcony room, specialty dining twice, the whole thing. Danny and I had been together 6 years before we finally got married, so by the time we stood on the pier in Fort Lauderdale, looking up at that white hull rising 11 decks above us, it felt like we'd earned every bit of it. At check-in, the woman behind the counter slid our cards across and said something almost automatic, the way people say next at a grocery line. Everything's already set up on your onboard account, gratuities and all, so just relax and enjoy the ship. I nodded and smiled and didn't really hear it, because Danny was already pulling me toward the escalator to find our cabin. That sentence sat in my memory the whole week without meaning anything. It would mean everything by the end. We'd talked before the trip about how we wanted to tip. Danny's dad used to bartend in Ocean City, and he drilled into Danny that cash is what people actually remember. that a $5 bill in someone's hand at the start of a shift buys better service and better stories for the rest of the week. So I'd gone to the bank before we left and gotten a stack of 1s, 10s, and 20s, folded them into an envelope, and told myself that was our tipping money, separate from everything else. The first night, at the pool bar, Danny handed the bartender a 5 before he'd even made our drinks, and the guy's whole face lit up in a way that felt like proof we were doing something right. I noticed the couple next to us order the same drinks and just sign the check to their room. No cash at all. I remember feeling almost sorry for the bartender, like we were the only ones actually taking care of him. It's strange to think back on that now, because at the time it felt like generosity, and now it just feels like we were the only 2 people at that bar who didn't know something everyone else did. Our room steward was a quiet man named Noel, from Cebu, who kept our cabin so clean it looked untouched, even after we'd clearly used the towels he'd folded into little animals on the bed. The first time Danny handed him a 20, tucked right into his hand, the way his dad had taught him, Noel's face did something I couldn't quite place. Not the delight the bartender had shown, more like he wasn't sure what to do with his hand for a second, like he was working something out in his head. He thanked us, said it really wasn't necessary, and we laughed it off as him just being humble. We didn't think about it again. 2 days in, we got friendly with an older couple at our dinner table, Carol and Pete, who'd been on 11 cruises together. When Danny mentioned, almost proudly, that we'd been tipping cash all week, Carol laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Oh honey, we stopped doing that years ago. It's already on the bill." Danny said something about, maybe that's just how it works on other cruise lines, and she shrugged and let it go. And we moved on to talking about the excursion we all had booked in Cozumel the next day. I still don't know why neither of us asked a single follow-up question. I think we just didn't want to hear it. In Cozumel, we did a snorkeling and jeep tour with a small local outfit, 6 other tourists in the group, one guide named Hector who spent the whole day making us feel like old friends. At the end, before we got back on the tender boat, he lined everyone up near the van and said, loud enough for the whole group, that tips were not required but very, very appreciated. This is how we feed our families, while holding open a cloth bag. Nobody moved for a second. Then the man in front of us dropped in a 20, and Danny, not wanting to look cheap in front of strangers, put in 2 20s for the both of us. It didn't feel like a choice, so much as something we did, because everyone was watching. That night, back on the ship, Danny went to refill our tip envelope and found it thinner than he expected. We counted what was left, laughing at first, then not laughing, because we had 4 more days and less than $80 in cash. I remember a small crack opening up between us right there. Not quite an argument, more like the first moment money became a real thing again, instead of an idea. We ended up pulling $200 cash off our onboard account at the kiosk without thinking twice about it. By the 5th day, Noel and Danny had an easy rhythm going. A few words every morning about the weather, about his kids back home, about how many more contracts he had left before he could go home for good. On the second to last night, when Danny went to tip him again, Noel actually put a hand up, gentle, and said, "You really don't have to keep doing this for me, sir. I'm taken care of." Danny told him he wanted to, that we appreciated everything he'd done, and pressed the bill into his hand anyway. Noel smiled, thanked him, and let it go. Looking back, that was the clearest thing anyone said to us all week, and we still didn't hear it. The last night, after the final dinner, we sat out on our balcony with the printed account summary that gets slipped under the door before disembarkation, the one nobody really reads because you're supposed to just trust the total and go. I only opened it because I wanted to check the Wi-Fi package hadn't quietly renewed. Halfway down the page, under a line for specialty dining and a line for the wine package, there it was. Daily gratuities, $17.50 per person per day, times 2 people, times 7 nights. $245, already charged to the card on file since the night we boarded. I did the math on the cash out loud without meaning to. 50 to Noel across 3 separate tips, something like 60 to the bar staff over the week, 40 into Hector's bag in Cozumel, 40 more split between the dining room waiter and his assistant on the 2 formal nights. Another 20 or so in loose bills to the buffet staff and the towel guy at the pool. It came to almost $240, nearly dollar for dollar what had already been quietly billed to us since day one. Every memory from that week rearranged itself a little right there on the balcony. The bartender's delighted face, Noel's raised hand, Carol's laugh at dinner, Hector's open bag. All of it had been telling us the same thing in a dozen small ways, and we'd been too proud of our own generosity to actually hear any of it. The next morning, before we disembarked, Danny stood in line at guest services, half expecting someone to apologize or admit a mistake. The woman there was polite and unbothered, in the way of someone who'd had this exact conversation many times before. She pulled up our booking and showed us, on page 4 of the cruise contract we'd signed, and clicked through 9 months earlier, a paragraph disclosing the daily gratuity charge in plain language. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was just one paragraph among 40, sent in an email we'd been too excited to read closely, buried under photos of the ship. Nobody had lied to us. We just hadn't done the reading, and the system had been built, whether on purpose or not, to reward exactly that kind of oversight. While Danny was at guest services, I went to say goodbye to Noel and told him, half joking, half not, what we'd found. I expected him to look surprised, maybe apologetic. Instead, he nodded slowly and said something that stayed with me longer than the account summary ever did. He explained, carefully, like he'd chosen the words in advance, that the cash we'd given him directly didn't always stay with him the way we thought. Some of it went into a pool, shared across the whole housekeeping team by ship policy. Some crew split their tips with the assistants who did half the actual work in a cabin, and the automatic gratuity ran on a completely separate schedule that had nothing to do with our envelope at all. He wasn't complaining. He said it the way someone describes a paycheck, but it meant that even the part of our tipping that had felt personal, the part we thought went straight to the man who folded our towels into swans every night, hadn't landed the way we pictured it. We didn't talk about it much on the flight home. It felt like a small, embarrassing thing to be upset about. A few $100s on a trip that had otherwise been the best week of our lives. Then the credit card statement came about 3 weeks later, and Danny found the 2 cash withdrawals from the ship's kiosk, sitting on their own lines. Each one hit with a cash advance fee and a currency conversion charge we hadn't noticed, standing at a machine with a line of people behind us. $44, just for the privilege of turning our own money into cash so we could hand it back to the ship's own employees. Danny actually laughed when he saw it, not because it was funny, but because there wasn't much else left to do with it by then. We still talk about that cruise as the trip that started our marriage right. The sunsets off the back deck, the terrible karaoke night, Noel's animal towels. We just talk about the tipping a little differently now. Not with anger, more like the quiet embarrassment of realizing you clapped at the wrong moment in a play everyone else understood. Before our next cruise, I read every page of the contract, twice, and found the gratuity line in about 4 minutes. We still tip in cash sometimes, for something specific, something that feels personal in the moment. But we check the account summary first, now, every single day if we have to, because the tip you don't know you've already paid is still a tip, and it still comes out of the same honeymoon budget either way. I want to tell you about the 7 days I spent crossing the Atlantic Ocean, because somewhere around day 3, a woman with very gentle hands and a very good sales script took almost $800 off me while I was lying face down with my eyes closed. I want to walk you through exactly how it happened, step by step, because I think if you'd been in that room, in that exact chair, you might have done the same thing I did. And I don't want that to happen to you. I'd booked the crossing on my own, 7 nights, no port stops at all, just open water the whole way from Southampton to New York. I'd never done a solo trip before. My marriage had ended 8 months earlier, and I told myself this was the thing you do afterward. You get on a boat by yourself and you eat dinner alone, and you prove to yourself you still know how to enjoy things. I was proud of myself for booking it. I want you to remember that, because it matters later. The first night, a flyer showed up under my cabin door. It advertised a Port Day Spa special, 50% off a signature massage, and I remember laughing a little, because we were 3 days from any port in either direction. There was nowhere to go. That's actually the whole trick of a transatlantic crossing. I'd figure out later. No ports means no distractions. Means a boat full of bored people with nothing to spend their afternoon on except whatever the ship puts in front of them. The spa knew exactly what kind of day it was selling into. I called down the next morning to book it, and that's the first place I should have slowed down and didn't. The woman on the phone was warm and fast. She needed my cabin number and a card on file, and she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I'd need to sign a standard treatment waiver when I arrived. Nothing unusual. Everyone signs it. I said sure. I want to be honest with you. I didn't think about that waiver again until it was much too late to matter. I showed up at 2 in the afternoon to a spa that looked like something out of a magazine. Dim lighting, warm towels, a receptionist who handed me a clipboard and a pen at the exact same moment she was walking me back toward the changing room so that I was signing while I was moving, half listening to her explain where the robes were. I signed. I didn't read it. I want to be really clear with you about that because it's the detail every single spa scam depends on, and it worked on me, even though I've heard this story told 100 different ways by other people. The massage itself, for the first 20 minutes, was genuinely wonderful. That's not nothing. That's actually part of how it works. They give you something real before they take something from you. Around the halfway mark, the therapist's hands stopped moving in that rhythm they'd had, and she got quiet. And then she said, in this soft, concerned voice, that she was feeling a lot of tension and something that felt like fluid buildup along my shoulder blades. And had anyone ever told me that before? I said no. She said she wasn't surprised. Most people don't know, and she thought I'd really benefit from a treatment bundle they had. A detox wrap and a course of the oil she was using. And she started listing a price while her hands were still on my back, and I was still face down on a table with a sheet over my hips. In a room I didn't know the layout of, unable to see her face or check a clock, or really do anything, except lie there and listen to a woman I'd trusted for the last 20 minutes, tell me my body needed fixing. I said I'd think about it. She kept going anyway. That was the moment the whole thing tipped over from a massage into something else, and I didn't leave, because leaving meant sitting up, oil-covered, half-dressed, in front of a stranger who hadn't stopped talking, and that felt so much harder in the moment than it sounds like it should have been. Sitting here telling you about it now. I bought the smallest version of the bundle, just to make her stop talking. 45 minutes after I'd walked in for a 50% off massage, I walked out having agreed to something I hadn't asked for, and I felt fine about it, honestly. A little silly, but fine, because I told myself it was maybe $80 or $90, and I'd have a nice oil to bring home. That night, I checked my onboard account on the stateroom television, mostly out of habit, and the charge sitting there was $780. Not $90, $780. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it 4 times, thinking the number had to be a system error, a duplicate charge, anything other than what it actually was, which was the full retail price of a starter kit I'd apparently agreed to enroll in with monthly shipments, on top of the treatment itself. That was the moment the story stopped being embarrassing and started being something I needed to actually fix. I went down to guest services the next morning, ready to get it reversed. And this is where it got worse instead of better. The woman at the desk pulled up my folio, looked at it for a second, and then slid a printed page across the counter. It was the waiver. My signature was on it, and buried in paragraph 3, in the same font as everything else, was a line authorizing recurring product enrollment at the therapist's discretion based on treatment recommendations. I had signed that, walking backward, while a receptionist talked to me about robes. Guest services told me, politely but firmly, that per the signed agreement the purchase was final, and that if I had concerns I was welcome to speak with the spa manager directly. I remember standing there thinking, I did this to myself, and feeling about as small as I've ever felt on a vacation I was supposed to be proud of. That night at the bar, still annoyed with myself, I ended up next to a woman a little older than me, traveling alone too, and somehow the spa came up, and she went quiet in a way I recognized instantly. And then she said, almost in a whisper, that she'd been charged $1,100 2 days earlier for something almost identical. A wrap, a bundle, a signature she didn't remember agreeing to. Hearing her say it out loud is what changed everything for me. Because up until that point, I had genuinely believed this was a story about my own bad judgment. It wasn't. It was a pattern, and she and I were not the only two people it had happened to. The next piece came from someone I didn't expect. A young steward who'd been bringing ice to my cabin all week overheard me venting to my cabin neighbor in the hallway, and once the guest services woman was out of earshot, he said something quietly that I still think about. He said the spa wasn't actually run by the cruise line at all. It was a separate company that leased the space on board, paid the ship a cut of every sale, and set its own staffing and pricing, entirely independent of the cruise line's customer service standards. That's why guest services could apologize and still do nothing. It wasn't their department to fix. It was a business operating a storefront inside someone else's ship, answerable mostly to itself. Armed with that, I went back to the spa manager directly, calm, wanting an itemized breakdown of exactly what I'd been charged for. She was polite for about 90 seconds, and then, when I said I wanted to formally dispute it, her tone changed entirely. She told me, evenly, that guests who caused disruptions to spa operations could be noted in the ship's guest file, which could affect future bookings across the whole cruise line's fleet. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't dramatic. It was said the way you'd mention the weather, and that's exactly what made it land. I wasn't being scammed anymore in that moment. I was being managed. I used the ship's outrageously expensive Wi-Fi to call my credit card company that same afternoon, mostly out of frustration, and the representative on the phone did something I didn't expect. She put me on a brief hold, came back, and told me that merchant code had generated an unusual number of disputes over the past year, enough that it had been internally flagged. She couldn't tell me numbers, but she told me enough for me to understand that whatever was happening to me had happened to a lot of other people before I ever set foot on that ship, and that the company processing my card already knew it. 2 days later, on one of the last sea days before New York, I ran into the same steward again, and this time he told me something that made the whole thing click into a shape I hadn't seen yet. He said the therapists worked almost entirely on commission, with monthly sales targets set by the leasing company, and that 2 therapists had been let go earlier that year for consistently missing their numbers, regardless of how their actual massage skills were reviewed. Suddenly, the woman with her hands still on my back, talking prices into the side of my face, wasn't some uniquely aggressive person. She was someone with rent to pay, working inside a system built to squeeze her into squeezing me. I was angry at the company in a completely different way after that, and less angry, oddly, at her. That same night, the woman from the bar and I compared notes properly for the first time, and we noticed something neither of us had thought to check. We were both solo travelers in single-occupancy cabins. When we asked around, quietly, at breakfast the next morning, we found 4 more women, all solo, all in single cabins, all targeted with the exact same Port Day special flyer, on the exact same day of the crossing. The men we asked, traveling with partners or families, mostly hadn't gotten the flyer at all, or had ignored it without a second thought. It stopped feeling like bad luck at that point. It felt like a list. 6 of us walked down to guest services together on the second to last day, folios printed, signatures highlighted, and asked to speak to the most senior officer available, together, in the same room, at the same time. I want to tell you honestly, that changed the entire temperature of the conversation. One woman alone is easy to manage with a line about disruption notes on her file. 6 women, with 6 nearly identical stories and 6 printed receipts, are a pattern somebody has to explain in writing. Within an hour, the spa manager who'd been so calm about veiled threats a few days earlier was offering partial refunds to every one of us. No admission of wrongdoing, just numbers moving quietly back onto our folios before we docked in New York. I thought that was where the story ended. Refund on the books. Lesson learned. One weird story to tell at dinner parties. It wasn't. Quite. About 6 weeks after I got home, my credit card company sent me copies of the documentation the spa company had submitted to contest part of my dispute. Standard procedure, they said, whenever a merchant pushes back. And sitting in that packet was a copy of my signed waiver, the same one I remembered signing while walking through a hallway. Except the itemized product list attached to it had 2 additional line items on it that hadn't been there when I photographed my own copy on the ship, and the file's metadata, which my bank flagged for me without me even asking, showed it had been modified 2 days after I signed it. Not read wrong by me, not a misunderstanding. Changed, after the fact, once they knew I was disputing the charge. That one detail turned a story about an aggressive sales pitch into something else entirely, something my bank's fraud department took a lot more seriously once I sent it to them. The full charge was reversed within 3 weeks, all $780 of it. No partial refund, no negotiation. I also filed what I had with the Maritime Consumer Complaint Line for the cruise line's flag state, mostly so there'd be a record sitting somewhere with my name on it and the word fraud actually written down instead of implied. I think about that crossing a lot, and not because of the ocean, which was beautiful, or the dinners, which were lovely, but because of how ordinary every single step of it felt while it was happening. Nobody grabbed me. Nobody raised their voice. I made a series of small, reasonable-feeling decisions. Sign the form while walking. Stay on the table because standing up felt awkward. Buy the small version instead of making a scene. And each one of those small decisions was exactly what the whole system was built to expect from someone like me. So if you're planning a trip like this, here's what I'd actually tell you. Not as a warning to scare you off spas, because a good massage is still a good massage. Decide what you're willing to spend before you ever walk through that door, and hold that number in your head like it's already spent. Read what you're signing, even if someone is walking you backward while you do it. Even if it feels rude to stop and read. And if a pitch starts while you are lying down, oiled up, half undressed, you are still allowed to say no, out loud, and sit up, and leave the room, even mid-treatment, even if it's awkward, even if you've already paid for the hour. A firm no doesn't need a good moment to happen in. It just needs to happen. We saved for 11 years for that cruise. Not vacation money, not birthday cash stuffed in a coffee can, actual budgeted, spreadsheet tracked, skip a few dinners out saving. Because 40 years of marriage felt like it deserved something bigger than a nice restaurant and a card from the grandkids. Diane wanted the Caribbean. I wanted her happy. So we booked the balcony cabin, packed the good clothes, and told ourselves this was the trip where we'd finally stop being careful with money and just enjoy it. The morning we docked, a glossy little booklet showed up under our cabin door, ship letterhead across the top, the cruise line's logo stamped on every page like a seal of approval. Best shops of the port, it said, handpicked by your cruise director. There was even a quote from him personally, something about how his own wife bought her anniversary ring at one of these very stores, and how thrilled she was. It read like advice from a friend. That was the whole trick. Though we didn't know it yet. It wasn't advice. It was rented space, paid for by the inch, and the hand-picked stores were the ones that wrote the biggest check to be hand-picked. We walked off that ship with the booklet folded in Diane's purse like a treasure map, and in a way it was, just not treasure for us. The store the map circled twice was called Ocean Crown, tucked between a rum shop and a place selling hats nobody needed. Before we'd even said our name, the man at the door greeted us like regulars. Mr. and Mrs. Kessler, cabin 821 welcome, welcome. We hadn't given him a boarding pass. We hadn't said a word. Diane squeezed my arm and whispered, "Isn't that nice? They remembered us from the excursion desk." I said maybe. I didn't like it, but I didn't have a name for why yet, so I let it go. Because that's what 40 years of marriage teaches you. Sometimes you let the small, wrong feeling go so you don't ruin the day. Inside, it was cold in that deliberate retail way. Bright cases, a salesman named Ricky, with a laugh that came a half-second too fast. He walked Diane to a case of diamond bracelets like he'd been saving one specifically for her, which, again, felt flattering at the time. He said the words, "today only," so smoothly, it barely registered as a sales tactic. Ship discount. Expires when you sail tonight. Final price. Won't see it again. $12,000 appraised value. Yours today for $4,800. While Ricky wrote up the ticket, I stepped toward the window to get some air, and that's when I heard it. Another voice. Another couple. 2 cases down. Same script. Word for word. Today only. Won't see it again. Appraised at. Not similar. Identical. Down to the pause before the number. I remember standing there feeling something shift in my stomach. That specific feeling you get when you realize the friendly conversation you were just having was actually a script somebody read to you, and you were just slow to notice the seams. I didn't say anything. Diane already had the bracelet on her wrist, turning it in the light, and her face looked the way it looked on our wedding day, and I wasn't going to be the man who ruined that over a hunch. Ricky noticed her other ring, her original wedding band, the one I saved 2 years' salary for back in 1986, and offered, so kindly, to give it a professional cleaning while he finished our paperwork. No charge, of course. Diane slid it off without a second thought. He disappeared into the back with it, for maybe 4 minutes. When he came back, it looked the same. Shined up nice. We didn't think about it again. Why would we? We put $4,800 of our anniversary money on the card, took the little velvet box and a laminated appraisal certificate with an official-sounding lab name at the bottom, and we walked back to the ship, feeling like we'd gotten away with something. That's the part that still turns my stomach. We felt lucky. 3 weeks after we got home, our neighbor's son, who does gemology on the side, offered to take a look at the bracelet just for fun. I watched his face change the way you'd watch a doctor's face change reading an x-ray. $600, he said. Maybe $650 if I found the right buyer. Not $12,000. Not even the $4,800 we paid. Diane didn't cry. She just sat down. I remember that more than anything. She just sat down slowly, like her legs had an opinion about it before her brain did. But the jeweler wasn't done. He asked, almost as an afterthought, if he could look at Diane's wedding ring too, out of professional curiosity. He turned it under the light longer than he needed to. Then he asked when we'd last had it cleaned professionally. Diane told him about Ocean Crown. He set it down real gentle, like it might shatter, and told us the center stone in that ring was not the stone he'd expect from an 86 setting. Different cut, different clarity, set slightly off from the original prongs. Somebody had swapped it. Not the bracelet, her actual wedding ring, the one I gave her, the one that meant something no discount ever could. That was the moment the whole trip curdled in my memory. Because up until then, we were angry about money. Now we were something worse. I called the cruise line first, thinking surely they'd want to know one of their hand-picked partners was running a switch and swap operation. A very polite woman read me a line from the cruise contract we'd signed and never read. Something about the shopping guide being provided for informational purposes only, no endorsement implied, no liability assumed. 11 years of saving, and the fine print had already decided whose side they were on before we ever boarded. Diane, who does not quit easily, found a Facebook group for cruise passengers a few nights later. 40, 50 posts. Different ships, different sailings, same port, same phrase. Today only. Same $12,000 appraisal number, showing up again and again, like a magic trick nobody bothered to vary. It wasn't one bad salesman having a rough month. It was a system, running the same lines on every ship that docked, probably every single day, because today only doesn't mean anything when it's true every day for years. We tried the appraisal certificate route next, thinking that piece of paper with its official lab name might be worth something in a fight. Took about 20 minutes of searching to find that the independent lab listed on our certificate shared a business address with Ocean Crown itself. Same suite number, different sign on the door. The appraisal wasn't independent. It was the fox notarizing the hen house. Then came the one that really got me, the one I didn't see coming from that angle at all. Our travel agent, Denise, has been a friend of ours for almost 20 years. Did our anniversary booking as a favor. Buried in our packet We found the same glossy insert as a preferred partner enclosure, a referral fee line item, so small you'd need reading glasses, and a reason to be suspicious to catch it. She likely never even registered what she was forwarding. But that's the part that stings in a different way than the ring. You can be angry at a stranger in a jewelry store easily enough. It's harder when the chain of people who let you down includes someone who held your hand at our wedding. We tried filing something with the local police on the island, and got the answer you'd expect if you've ever dealt with anything crossing borders. Wrong jurisdiction, ships flagged in another country, store ownership routed through some holding company registered somewhere none of us could pronounce. Nobody was going to arrest anybody over our ring. The credit card company fought us for months, denied the dispute twice, citing the signed receipt and the laminated certificate as proof of fair value. It was Denise's husband, of all people, a contract lawyer trying to make up for what his wife's brochure had done to us, who found the crack. You can't use a fraudulent appraisal from a non-independent source as proof of anything. 6 months after the trip, we got about half our money back. Not the ring. Nobody was giving us the ring. Whatever they did with the real stone, it wasn't coming home. We went back to the Caribbean the following year, different ship, and out of some morbid curiosity, we walked past that same strip of shops. Ocean Crown wasn't there anymore. In its place, same location, same layout, same cold, bright cases, a store with a brand new name, and a young man at the door who said, "Welcome, welcome," like he meant it. We stood outside for a minute, Diane and I, watching an older couple walk in, clutching a familiar-looking glossy booklet. Neither of us went in to warn them. I'd like to tell you that's because we tried and got kicked out. Something dramatic like that. Truth is, we'd learned by then that warnings mostly bounce off people mid-vacation the same way they bounced off us. So we just found a bench with a decent view of the door, ordered 2 rum drinks from a cart nearby, and made a quiet bet on how many pieces that couple would walk out with. Diane said 2, I said 3, and I was right. Which tells you something about how none of this actually stops. It just changes its sign out front every season. If there's anything worth taking from all of it, it's not complicated, and I wish somebody had said it to us plainly before we ever left that ship. A map handed to you by the people selling your cabin isn't advice. It's an advertisement wearing a friendlier coat. Any appraisal that comes free with the purchase, in the very same building where you bought the thing, isn't proof of value. It's part of the sale. If you want the truth about what something is worth, you take it somewhere with no stake in the answer. Before you hand over the card, not after. We learned that the expensive way, the same way most people seem to. 40 years married, and the 2 of us still laugh about it now, in that tired way you laugh when the alternative is something worse. Because the bracelet's in a drawer somewhere, worthless and ours, and the ring that actually mattered is gone, and somewhere on that island, the lights are still on, and the sign out front has probably already changed again. My mother had her hip replaced 8 months before we booked that cruise, and this trip was supposed to be proof to both of us that she could still move through the world without someone hovering at her elbow. 7 nights out of Rome, down through Sicily, back up the coast. Her first cruise. My first time traveling with her alone since my father died. We had a flight out of Fiumicino at 1:40 in the afternoon on disembarkation day, which the cruise line's own paperwork told us was cutting it close, and which we told ourselves would be fine, because Civitavecchia is only an hour from the airport if traffic behaves. We were off the ship by 7:15 that morning, which sounds early until you've stood in a customs hall with 1,100 other passengers and a woman with a new hip who can't do stairs quickly and won't admit it. By the time we cleared the terminal doors and hit the daylight, we were both running on the kind of tired that makes your decisions soft around the edges. Rolling suitcases, a shoulder bag cutting into my collarbone, my mother gripping my arm a little harder than she needed to, and in front of us, a curb absolutely lined with drivers. Most of them were holding cardboard with handwritten names on it, but one man, maybe 30 feet from the doors, was holding a printed sign with the cruise line's actual logo on it, laminated, professional looking, and he was wearing a navy polo shirt with an embroidered emblem that could have passed for the cruise line's own colors if you weren't looking closely. He had a lanyard around his neck with a laminated card on it, photo and all, though I couldn't have told you what it said. What I could tell you is that after 9 days of being handed drink cards and key cards and shore excursion tickets by people wearing lanyards, my brain had stopped treating a lanyard as information and started treating it as a costume that meant trust me. He smiled at us like he'd been waiting specifically for us, which, it turns out, he had been. He asked if we were headed to Fiumicino, and when I said yes, he said, 1:40 flight, see? You have time, but we go now, no problem. I remember being almost relieved that he knew that, like it confirmed he was legitimate, like it meant we were expected. I didn't stop to ask myself how a random man on a curb would know our flight time down to the minute. If I'm honest, I didn't want to ask, because asking would have meant standing there a while longer, figuring out where the real transfer desk was, and my mother's face had that gray, flattened look she gets when she's been upright too long. He quoted €70 for the ride, which was steep but not insane, so I said fine, and he took my mother's suitcase like a gentleman and loaded it into a white van with no markings on it that I registered at the time. It was only once we were both belted in and pulling away from the curb that he glanced at me in the mirror and said, almost as an afterthought, that 70 was for one passenger, and with two, it would be 140. I opened my mouth to argue and then looked at my mother, already leaning her head against the window with her eyes closed, and I did the math on how much energy I had left for a roadside fight with a stranger, and I said fine again. That word was doing a lot of work that day. We hadn't been driving 15 minutes before he left the signs for the autostrada and turned onto a smaller road, saying something about the highway being backed up from an accident and that he knew a faster way through. I've thought about that moment 100 times since, because it's such a small thing, a man saying shortcut, and it's exactly the kind of small thing you let go because you have no evidence to argue with, only a feeling, and feelings don't hold up well against a confident voice with a foreign accent explaining local roads to a tourist. About 40 minutes in, with my mother starting to shift and press her hand against her lower back, he pulled the van off the road in front of a low stucco building with leather bags hanging in the windows, and he said we'd stop 5 minutes, that his cousin ran the shop, that there was a clean bathroom inside for the signora. My mother needed a bathroom. That's the part that still gets me. He wasn't guessing. Every driver running this route knows that a woman in her 70s, who's been on a bus and a ship and a curb for 2 hours, is going to need a bathroom, and he used that need like a hook, because once you're inside that shop, using their bathroom, it's very hard to walk back out without buying something small out of guilt. We were in there 12 minutes, not 5. A young man who may or may not have actually been anyone's cousin walked me past leather wallets and belts, telling me prices that dropped every time I said no thank you, and when I finally said we had a flight to catch, the driver appeared at my elbow, not angry exactly, but wounded, saying it would help him, personally, if I bought even one small thing, because the shop paid him for bringing customers. I bought a €20 wallet I never use, mostly to make it stop. Back in the van, I pulled out my phone to check the time, and, out of habit more than suspicion, opened the map to see how much longer we had. The blue dot was not moving toward the airport icon. It was moving away from it, out toward what looked like farmland, the little route line stretching longer instead of shorter. I sat there for a second with my stomach dropping, that specific feeling of your own eyes disagreeing with what someone just told you. I said something to the driver about the map showing us going the wrong way, and his whole manner changed in about 2 seconds. The friendliness didn't just fade, it flipped, and he said the road ahead had a toll and traffic tax I hadn't been told about, that it would be another €60 on top of what we'd agreed, cash only, before he'd take us any further. When I said we didn't have that kind of cash on us, he actually slowed the van down, not stopping, just slowing, in a way that felt like a demonstration. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a rude cab driver and started thinking of it as something else, a thing I didn't have a name for yet. And my mother, who had been quiet through most of this with her eyes half closed, opened them fully and looked at me in a way that told me she'd been listening the whole time and was frightened too. which somehow scared me more than anything the driver had said. A few minutes later, he pulled into a gravel lot behind what looked like an auto repair place, and there were 2 other white vans already parked there, and 2 men leaning against one of them smoking, who looked up when we pulled in, like they knew the van, like this was a regular stop. Nobody said anything threatening. Nobody touched us. But I understood in my body before I understood it in words that this wasn't one dishonest man improvising. This was a system, a loop these vans ran, and we were cargo moving through it. I did the only thing I could think of. I put my phone to my ear, didn't even dial anyone, and started talking loudly in English about how my brother-in-law was a police officer back home, and how I was going to have the polizia meet us at the next stop if we weren't moving toward the airport in 5 minutes, and I made sure the driver could hear every word. I have no idea if he understood brother-in-law or police officer, but he understood the tone, and the 2 men by the other van were watching us now too, and something about all of it, the noise, the attention, the fact that we clearly weren't quiet, scared people who'd sit there and pay whatever he asked, made him mutter something under his breath, put the van in gear, and pull back out onto the road. He got us to the airport at 12:55, 45 minutes before our flight, on a route that should have taken 60 minutes total from the port, on a 9 o'clock start. We paid him what we'd originally agreed, in cash, because I wanted him gone more than I wanted to win the argument. And my mother and I actually ran, her hip and all, through a check-in line that was closing the bag drop as we reached it, and made the flight, because one gate agent took pity on a sweating woman with a cane. We didn't talk much on that flight. We were both too wrung out. It was 2 weeks later, going through my credit card statement to reconcile the trip, that I found a charge from a leather goods shop in Civitavecchia for €89, a shop I'd been in for 12 minutes, and bought one €20 wallet from, in cash. I called the bank, disputed it, and was told this exact pattern, small cash purchase, larger phantom charge appearing days later, was consistent with a card being skimmed at the point of sale. Somewhere in those 12 minutes, while I was being walked past leather goods by a man who might have been a cousin, my card had been read by something other than the register. What finally sat me down and made me write this out wasn't even the money. It was going back and looking at photos I'd taken outside the terminal that morning, just wide shots of the port, taken before we ever met that driver. In the corner of one of them, barely visible, is a folding table, with the actual cruise line's transfer desk sign on it, staffed, 30 feet from where we were standing when the man with the laminated lanyard walked up to us. We had walked right past the real thing to get scammed by a copy of it, and I never even saw it happen, because I wasn't looking for a desk. I was looking for someone to make the problem of getting to the airport go away, and the first person who offered to do that got to decide what happened to us for the next 4 hours. If you're putting your parents or yourself on a ship into a port you've never stood in before, book the transfer before you ever leave home, through the cruise line or a company with a name you can look up and a confirmation number in your hand. The real driver will already know your name because you gave it to him weeks ago, not because he guessed your flight time off a manifest he shouldn't have had. Nobody legitimate needs to solicit you off a curb. The people who do that are counting on exactly what happened to us. 2 exhausted travelers who just wanted someone else to take the decision out of their hands. We were 4 cruises in by then, which is just enough experience to make you dangerous. Enough to feel like you know the ropes. Enough to stop reading the fine print. Not enough to know better. That's the trap nobody warns you about. It's not the first-timers who get taken. It's the comfortable ones. The invitation came printed on heavy cardstock, slid under our cabin door on the second night. Champagne and canapes. 6 o'clock. The atrium gallery. Complimentary art auction. My husband Dan laughed and said it sounded like a way to kill an hour before dinner. And honestly, that's all we expected it to be. A little theater, some free bubbly. We walked in holding flutes that kept getting refilled by staff who never seemed to let a glass sit empty for more than a minute. And I remember thinking how easy the whole room felt, how loose everyone's shoulders were. The auctioneer was good. I mean genuinely good. The kind of good that should have been a warning sign on its own. He opened with cheap stuff, $100 here, $200 there, prints of lighthouses and sailboats that nobody in that room actually wanted hanging in their house. It was fun. It was low stakes. And then Dan, 3 glasses in, raised his paddle on a small numbered litho of a beach scene and won it for $80 under what the auctioneer called its gallery estimate. We felt clever. We felt like we'd found a little secret nobody else on the ship knew about. That win did something to us that I didn't understand until much later. It built trust. It made the whole apparatus feel legitimate. Because hadn't we just gotten a deal? Then the room changed. Staff wheeled out a piece under a black cloth, and the auctioneer's voice dropped into something slower, more reverent. He said the word Picasso like it was a prayer. Limited edition, hand-numbered, part of an authorized posthumous series, one of only a small run remaining in circulation. He held up a certificate in a leather folder, gold foil lettering, a wax-looking seal, and he walked it down the aisle so people could touch it, like it was a relic. I felt my pulse pick up before I even decided to feel anything. We weren't the only ones. A couple 2 rows over, sharp-dressed, older than us by maybe 10 years, started bidding almost immediately. And something about the way they bid, quick, confident, no hesitation, no whispered conferring with each other, pulled Dan in like a hook. He leaned over and said, "Lo, I think they know something we don't." That's exactly the kind of thought a room like that is built to plant in you. The bidding climbed fast. 4,000. 5. The other couple kept going, and Dan kept matching them, and I sat there with my heart going harder than it should have over a piece of paper, telling myself this was an investment, this was smart, this was the kind of thing you tell your kids about at Thanksgiving. When the other couple finally dropped out at 6,200, the whole room applauded us. Actual applause. Staff came over with more champagne. Someone shook Dan's hand like he'd closed a business deal, instead of bought a picture on a boat. They walked us to a side table with paperwork already half filled out, financing options laid out clean and easy, low monthly payments, nothing due until we got home. A woman with a clipboard was warm and patient, and never once rushed us, which somehow made it feel less like being rushed. We had a pen in hand. We were maybe 90 seconds from signing. That night at the bar, waiting on a table for dinner, an older man next to us in a faded ship polo asked what we'd been up to, and Dan, still glowing, told him about the piece. The man's face did something I can only describe as a wince he tried to swallow. He said, real quiet, almost like he didn't want to embarrass us, that he and his wife had bought one, just like that, 2 cruises back, same setup, same kind of certificate, and it was still sitting wrapped in brown paper in their garage because nobody would touch it for even 1/3 of what they paid. He wasn't trying to warn us. He was just making conversation. But it lodged in my chest like a splinter. I couldn't sleep that night. Dan was out cold, happy, and I lay there with my phone and the ship's slow, overpriced Wi-Fi, and I typed in the edition size and the print title. It took maybe 4 minutes to find the same exact print, same numbered edition, listed on a resale site for less than $400. Not sold. Listed. Sitting there unwanted for months. I kept going, because once that door opens you can't shut it. I looked up the auction company's name printed at the bottom of our paperwork, and I found their own certificate language, and it turned out the authentication wasn't coming from any independent art authority at all. It was the auction house itself, verifying its own inventory. They were grading their own homework and stamping it gold. Then I found the forums. Page after page of people, on this cruise line and others, describing almost the identical night we'd just had. The champagne, the small early win, the dramatic unveiling, the competing bidder, who vanished right after driving the price up. Someone had even started a thread naming the same auction company in a class action filing over exactly this kind of limited edition pricing on cruise ships. Reading it felt like watching a replay of our own evening from a camera we didn't know was there. And that's when it hit me. The thing that actually made my stomach drop. That couple who bid against us. I thought back on it and realized I never saw them again. Not at breakfast, not at the pool, not on formal night. $6,000 of enthusiasm, and then nothing, like they'd stepped off at the next port. I'm not saying I can prove they were planted there to run the price up. I can't. But I can tell you it stopped feeling like a coincidence somewhere around 2 in the morning. We had until 10 a.m. the next day to cancel before the sale finalized and the charge went through. I woke Dan up early, showed him everything on my phone, and to his credit, he didn't argue for more than a minute before his face fell the same way mine had. We went down to the gallery together, paperwork in hand, and the same warm woman with the clipboard was suddenly a lot less warm. She talked about how rare it was for people to walk away from a piece this significant. She mentioned, almost gently, that the price would only go up from here, that we were making a mistake we'd regret. For one wobbly second, standing there feeling embarrassed and small in front of her, I almost let her talk us back into it. That's the part that scares me looking back. Not the auction room, but that quiet counter the next morning, where the pressure was softer and somehow harder to fight. Dan asked for the cancellation in writing. She got quieter, printed something out, and it was done in about 4 minutes. We walked out of that gallery, lighter than we'd walked in from anywhere on that entire trip. We still went to dinner that night and laughed about it, but underneath the laughing was this real, cold understanding of how close we'd come to wiring $6,000 home for a piece of paper worth a few hundred at best, backed by a certificate that verified nothing except that someone on that ship really wanted our signature. We haven't set foot in a shipboard art auction since, not even for the free champagne. And when friends tell us they're heading out on a cruise, that's the first thing I mention now. Skip the gallery, drink the champagne somewhere else. Whatever they're calling rare that night, it almost never is. The ship was called the Horizon Dawn, and I almost didn't get on it. I stood at the gangway in Fort Lauderdale with my suitcase and felt like a woman wearing someone else's coat. Frank and I had cruised 3 times together, always in October, always requesting the same corner table in the dining room. This was the first October without him, and my daughter had booked the trip as a kind of intervention, the way you'd hand a shovel to someone who needs to dig their way out of something. I remember thinking I'd spend the week reading paperbacks by the pool and calling it healing. I did not expect a person. I certainly did not expect the particular kind of person who found me. His name was Arthur Lansing, and he sat down across from me on the second night, uninvited, at a table for 2 that had somehow become a table for 1 when the couple who'd been seated with me canceled. He asked if the seat was taken with the kind of courtesy that felt old-fashioned, the kind Frank used to have. Over the bread course he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd lost his wife 18 months earlier, that this was his way of learning to be a person alone in a room again. I felt something in my chest loosen. It is a specific kind of relief, finding another widow, or in this case a widower, someone who doesn't need the loss explained to them. I didn't ask if it was true. I had no reason to ask. Grief has a smell to it, a way people hold their shoulders, and his looked exactly like mine. By the 4th night we had a routine. Dinner, then a walk on the promenade deck, then he'd suggest we go see what the fools are doing in the casino, always framed as spectator sport, never as an invitation to play. I liked watching. There's a rhythm to a casino floor at night, the lights, the sound of chips, people performing hope for each other. One night he handed me a 20 and said, "Just try one hand, for the story of it." And I won $140 at a blackjack table before I understood the rules well enough to know if I'd played it right. I laughed out loud. I hadn't laughed out loud in over a year. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to what came after. That laugh is the thing he was actually selling me. It was the 5th morning, at the breakfast buffet, that a woman about my age touched my arm while I was reaching for the coffee. She looked at me carefully, the way you look at someone you're trying to place, and said, "Oh, you're the one he's been sitting with this week." There was something underneath the sentence I didn't examine closely enough at the time, a flatness in her voice that wasn't quite a compliment. Before I could ask what she meant, Arthur appeared behind me with 2 plates, and she smiled thinly and excused herself to find her husband. I asked Arthur later if he knew her. He said cruise ships are small towns. Everyone knows everyone by day 3. and I let it go. I've turned that moment over so many times since. She was trying to tell me something, and I was too grateful for the company to hear it. The stakes at the tables crept up the way a tide does. Not in a single wave, but in inches you don't notice until you're standing somewhere you didn't mean to stand. 20 became 60, became 200 a night. Arthur never once told me to bet more. That's important, because I've had to explain this to my son, and it sounds unbelievable when I say it plainly. He never pushed. He'd just say, when I hesitated, "One more won't hurt. We're on vacation." Or, "You were due for a win. Look at the shoe." On the 6th night, when my cash ran out, he was the one who mentioned that the casino would extend credit against my onboard account. A marker, he called it, simple as writing a check. He'd done it himself plenty of times, he said. Everybody does it, it's just paper. I signed it because he made it sound like the most ordinary thing in the world, and because some small, unspoken part of me didn't want the night with him to end yet. That same night, after I'd signed, he grew quiet over drinks and told me his son back home was having trouble, needed money moved quickly for something legal, a deposit, he said, and his own accounts were frozen in some dispute with a bank that made perfect sense at 11 at night with a rum drink in my hand and made no sense at all when I tried to describe it to my daughter weeks later. He asked if I could authorize a small transfer through the casino cage in his name, said he'd pay me back the moment we docked. I said yes. I want to say I hesitated. I don't think I did. I think I was so relieved to be needed by someone again that I would have signed almost anything. On the last night, he took my hand across the table at dinner and talked about visiting me in the spring, about how neither of us had expected this, how strange grief is, the way it opens a door you didn't know was still on its hinges. I remember thinking, with something close to shame, that I felt happier in that moment than I had in a very long time, and that Frank would have wanted that for me, and also that I felt like I was cheating on a dead man, which is its own particular kind of insanity. I gave him my address. I told him about Frank properly for the first time, the real stories, not the polished ones. He listened like it mattered. The next morning his cabin steward told me, when I knocked, that the room was empty, made up, no belongings. Guest had disembarked early at the crew gangway before sunrise for a connecting flight. Nothing unusual. "Sir does that sometimes, ma'am." I stood in that hallway holding a folded piece of paper with my address on it that I never got to give him, because he never asked for it again after all, and I told myself he'd call once we were both home. At guest services, settling my onboard account before disembarkation, the woman at the desk read me a total that didn't match any number I had been carrying in my head all week. Somewhere between the 20s and the markers and the transfer for his son, I had signed my way to just under $11,000. I remember asking her to run it again. She did. It was the same. I paid it with a credit card because you cannot leave a ship owing a casino money, and I stood at the rail as we pulled into port and watched Fort Lauderdale come up out of the water and felt nothing at all, which in hindsight was the actual beginning of feeling everything. It wasn't until I was home, 3 weeks later, going through the confirmation folder my son had assembled before the trip, that I found the printout he'd left in there, and I'd never read, an article about companion scams on cruise ships, women my age, men my age, professional and warm and patient, working the casino pit bosses for a cut of what they steered. I had shoved it in the folder without looking at it, because I didn't want to imagine anyone taking advantage of me. That's its own kind of arrogance, I've since learned. Thinking you're too smart or too sad to be a target, when sad is exactly the target. I called the woman from the breakfast buffet. I'd kept her cabin number from the manifest, absurdly, and the cruise line helped me trace an email. She wrote back within a day. She told me Arthur, or whatever his real name was, had sat with her sister 2 cruises earlier, on a different ship line entirely, and her sister had lost almost $19,000, and never told anyone, until it was too late to do much about it. There were at least 2 other women, she said, that she personally knew of. It wasn't one man improvising. It was a method, refined over dozens of sailings. And somewhere in it was a pit boss or a casino host taking a percentage for every mark walked to the tables. 6 months later, a woman from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit called me, following up on a joint complaint filed by 4 of us across 3 cruise lines. She told me his real name wasn't Arthur Lansing at all, that he'd been picked up trying to board a ship out of Galveston under a third identity, and that the money, spread across cash transfers and casino markers laundered as gambling losses, was almost certainly gone for good. I asked her what happens now. She said his photograph goes to every casino host and cruise security office in the country, and he doesn't sail again under any name they can track. That was the whole ending. No dramatic courtroom scene, no check in the mail, just a man's face on a list somewhere, and 4 women who never met each other before this, now texting each other on birthdays. I think about that 4th night at the blackjack table more than I think about the $11,000, honestly. The laugh, how easy it was to hand that to a stranger, not because I was foolish, but because I was starving for it, and he knew exactly how to look like food. I still take walks on ship decks. I went on another cruise last spring, alone again, and I ate dinner at a table for 2, and when a very charming man asked if the seat across from me was taken, I told him no, but I'd rather eat alone tonight, and I meant it kindly, and I meant it as an act of self-preservation, and both of those things were true at once, the way most things involving grief usually are.